So for over a year, I've been seeing the rise of Spider-Man 3 defenders making videos explaining why the third entry in the Sam Raimi trilogy wasn't as bad as people have been making it out to be over the years, which I'm glad because I always felt like that movie had its fair share of strengths, even if I would still argue it's largely a mediocre movie. Nevertheless, I'm hoping for one day the same thing happens to The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which, to be completely honest, it's probably not gonna happen. When I first watched it back in 2014, I actually thought it was my favorite Spider-Man movie. But over the years, it's becoming more and more difficult for me to ignore some of the plot contrivances, cheesy dialogue, wonky editing, both visual and script-wise, and the action scenes ended up not being as exciting as I thought they would be. While I would still make the argument that the movie does have some pretty good and memorable shots with gorgeous electric waves, the choreography is, well, kinda iffy. I don't think these fights are gonna hold up in a few decades. However, this movie does have some good things about it, and it really upsets me that no one talks about them. Last year, I even made a video defending Electro because I just felt like people were giving him too much shit. Also, speaking of which, someone in my comment section pointed out that there was a deleted scene that sort of explored Max's relationship with his family, mainly her mom, and it was suggested that she's not too fond of him. She didn't really seem to give a shit about the fact that it was his birthday, which kind of further adds to the premise of Max's psychotic desire for attention. Also, she seemed to be in critical condition, which, I don't know, maybe it doesn't really mean anything, although the fact that his mother was dying probably also didn't help his mental stability. And while I don't want to talk about Max in this video because I think I've already made my points clear in my last video about this subject, I would like to also address a scene where Max was talking to Gwen, and when the news was reporting on a Spider-Man deed, he expressed how he really admires the amount of attention Spider-Man receives, which sort of implies that his resentment towards Spider-Man could also partially be driven by jealousy. That incident in Times Square probably amplified those feelings he may have initially had even before he turned on him. But anyway, no more Max talk. He's a fine villain. He doesn't deserve the amount of shit he receives. The point of this video is to highlight the other aspects of this movie I feel were good. The first one is by far the most controversial one, which is the soundtrack. I get really salty whenever I see people sharing some mean things about what's arguably the best thing about this movie. Now, I love Danny Elfman's music, and in some ways I actually think he did a better job with the music composition than Hans Zimmer. Still, I don't know if I'm the only one that noticed this, but there are some instances where his music can get a little bit dry. Funny enough, I thought Spider-Man 3 had the best soundtrack, and I think it was partially because Danny Elfman was collaborating with Christopher Young. Plus, I think Danny Elfman once said that he kind of hated his experience composing for Spider-Man 2 and complained about the reliance on temp music, which prevented him from inputting his own creative juice. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, on the other hand, while the music does at times feel derivative of other works, especially once you become familiar with Hans Zimmer's discography. I mean, during the scene where Harry in his Green Goblin suit first showed up, the song that was playing was pretty much a ripoff of a certain portion of Crisis 2's main theme. But even then, I would still grandstand the idea that the music in this movie, while not necessarily better than Danny Elfman's overall contribution to the Maguire movies, it is debatably more consistently exhilarating to listen. Even though I mostly grew up with the Sam Raimi trilogy, I find Spider-Man's main theme by Hans Zimmer to be the definitive one. In the Sam Raimi movies, the closest that came to a Spider-Man theme song was either a rehash or just a simple cut of the opening music that plays in every single one of those movies, which, don't get me wrong, I love that song. I will refuse to skip the opening sequences regardless of how long they are, simply because they sound so good. But I could never perceive them as appropriate theme songs for Spider-Man, aka the definitive tune you would hear every time you think of or witness the masked vigilante. But the one from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, I would argue fits that criteria, even better than honestly any Spider-Man movie I've seen. The one from the first Amazing movie sounded too mellow, and the one from Homecoming is... it's fine I guess. Hans Zimmer's delivery just simply managed to hit that core feeling of bliss, hope, and heroism better than any movie has in my opinion. And this is just one of the many areas that I found to be effective. The opening sequence of this movie has honestly one of my favorite examples of introductory scenes with immediately gripping background music. During the Sony/Columbia logo presentation, things sounded so quiet but still somewhat tense, with the addition of vocals right before we moved to the Marvel logo featuring louder instruments and pumping up the tension with Hans Zimmer's classic and identifiable style at play, and shit just sounds more and more exhilarating as you watch the scene. I'd also just like to briefly highlight some moments I found to be pretty sweet sounding. I really like it when they play a piano cover of Spider-Man's theme song, like when Spidey saved that kid from a bunch of bullies, or to be more specific with the names of the tracks, the one called Ground Rules is very, very touching. During the montage taking place around the beginning of the movie, the last clip that plays shows Spidey kind of stalking Gwen, and the piano playing in the background was just, well, it was good, especially because it served as a relief from the previous somewhat energetic score playing while Spidey was going around doing his shit during the montage. There was also some pretty good shot composition present there, very underappreciated I would say. The last conversation between Harry and his father, I'm not even gonna fucking argue with anyone. The music was great. It's not a very complex score, and it's not like I'll listen to it every day while going to school. In fact, it's very scene specific, not necessarily something that stands out individually as a listenable song. But it's still very atmospheric, sounding pretty dark, eerie, and fitting for the scene itself. My last example is the subway station scene with the Man of Steel-esque hopeful vibe that the music was giving. I think the soundtrack's biggest weakness is whenever it inserts external licensed music. I just don't think the song choices are perfect. I definitely think that movie is at its best when it relies on its original music composed by Hans Zimmer. Although, speaking of which, I do want to talk about what's probably the most overhated instance of this, and you guys probably know what I'm referring. Let's address the Gone 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 scene. And I will do it for you. Like, Jesus, everyone's so fucking hostile towards this song choice. One argument I tend to hear is that the song is too lighthearted, in spite of the fact that the scene itself was meant to be serious. Now, I don't know if it's just me, but I don't think Philip Phillips' Gone 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 is all that happy sounding. I mean, discounting the chorus, which I'll get into in a moment, the verse itself is very mellow and sentimental, especially when you pay attention to the lyrics. And also, I would argue that the energetic nature of the chorus sort of adds to the sudden boost in motivation on Peter's part when he decided to learn more about his parents. Before then, he looked kind of down and stressed, but then immediately it was like he was working on a fucking police case. Some people say that this was bad writing because the change of action was immediate, but speaking from experience, I've had instances in my life where something was putting me on a sour mood and I was so desperate to do anything to stop me from thinking about it that once something came in mind that I could just focus all my attention to at that moment, I immediately jumped into it. In fact, that's how most of my videos come to life. Plus, Peter probably already had his parents in mind for a while. This was definitely not the first time he had thought about them. It's just that he had been ignoring that mystery for a long time because he was likely busy enough with other stuff that he didn't want to add extra layers of concern to his day-to-day life. I guess there's also no way for me to avoid the inevitable subject of the Electro theme, another very controversial musical score. Every time I see people talk shit about Electro's theme, two things inevitably come to mind. The first one has to do with the injection of dubstep. Now, I'm just gonna strip my pants and be completely transparent. I feel like it's only fair for me to share some of my biases. Back in 2014, especially in 2014, I was a dubstep manic. I loved the shit out of it more than any other subgenre of EDM. So I fully admit that my appreciation for dubstep back in the day made me like Electro's theme probably more than others would. But even today, not that I don't necessarily like dubstep anymore, but I'm definitely not as into as I was back then, and I'm certainly more critical of it. Even then, I don't see much wrong with Electro's theme. A lot of people like to make the argument that dubstep doesn't work because it's not a style of music made for serious cinematic action scenes, but I feel like this is a very closed-minded way of thinking. Trying to limit what specific genres are allowed to convey in film is essentially being anti-experimentation. Sure, your average sounding dubstep is obviously not going to be fitting to every single scene imaginable, but it can be if you twist it enough to make it appropriate. Just for fun, back when this movie was released, someone called Alvin Risk, big fan of by the way, released a remix of Electro's theme, and if you compare both versions with each other, you'll notice a major difference in tone, because Alvin Risk was actually going for the fun, trippy atmosphere you expect from dubstep. Hans Zimmer wasn't. In fact, Electro's theme for the most part isn't even dubstep. There's just one moment alone, during the Times Square scene, when Electro was pissed off and started destroying shit while flying. That was the only time Electro's theme was legitimately dubstep. In any other instance, it was either a regular ass film score with usage of some electronic instrument commonly used for dubstep, or it was just this weird Dutch house hybrid, which even then, instances like these were just as rare as the Times Square scene. And even when you observe these little EDM shifts, they usually don't sound like typical EDM. There's very clearly some degree of effort put into blending these genres with Hans Zimmer's synthetic orchestra style in order to create something that sounds unique and also matches with the tone of the scenes. Plus, given the nature of Electro, having these dubstep-ish sound effects is actually kind of appropriate. I mean, if you want to argue that they just did it because they wanted to pander to kids, I mean, fine, that's a fair point I guess, but I don't necessarily think that takes away from the quality of the music. I mean, if you don't like Electro's theme, whatever, I suppose, we can agree to disagree. For me personally, while Hans Zimmer has produced better, more coherent, and slightly more harmonic music than this, I thought it was still super memorable and hype as fuck. And before anyone accuses me of being biased and claim that I only like Electro's theme because I have a history with dubstep, well, a few months ago, I watched the first few episodes of Parasite. That series featured dubstep during some of the action scenes, and I didn't dig it. I thought it sounded strange, so don't come at me and say that I'm only biased because I'm a dubstep junkie, even though I don't even listen to it anymore. Moving on from this subject, earlier on I talked about hype, which reminded me of the internal voices that played during those scores. A lot of people like to make fun of them, calling it goofy and dumb, which I mean, sure, I agree it's goofy, not any goofier than the fact that it's a fucking comic book movie. And also, they were pretty effective at building up excitement. A lot of the time when the internal voices were being performed, they were hyping up something big and destructive that Electro would eventually do. Now, look, this just basically boils down to our own subjectivity. If you think they sound stupid, I don't think there's anything I could say to convince you otherwise. But it's the same story vice versa, so let's just leave it at that. The final thing I want to talk about is perhaps my favorite character in this movie, Harry Osborn. Now, I don't think he was entirely well handled, wasn't too big into his acting performance, and I think some aspects of his development felt rushed, or at least unclear and too vague, but I just really like how nuanced he is. This is a guy for most of his life was utterly neglected by his own father, and from his perspective, he could only really conclude that his father was a big dick, but there was more to that. Norman definitely did care for Harry, which is why he put so much effort into getting him to study in all of these foreign countries and had high amounts of expectations for him, but still felt like he was underperforming. Nevertheless, his desire to see his son tap his potential wasn't just driven by ego and reputation. They had a genetic disease, and Harry, being the next descendant, was also at risk of dying, and he had to push himself in order to find a cure for this genetic disease. It was strange that he only decided to tell Harry all of this after he was about to die. This is just one of the many plot holes present in this movie, but I can still find intrigue in the dynamic between these two and the amount of neglectfulness Harry had to receive throughout his childhood, coupled with the fact that he had just lost his father, which noticeably made him bitter. During his meeting with the board, he was completely cynical and had absolutely no compassion or interest in any of his fellow businessmen and the reputation of his company. He was just doing whatever the fuck he felt like it. Throughout his life, he was just told to do this, go there. Then his father dies and now he's forced to bear the responsibility of taking care of an entire company. At that point, he was just done and decided that now that he's the heir to the throne, he can just do whatever the fuck he wants, including promoting an assistant he only kind of recognizes and putting her in a position above all of these important lawyers and board members. He doesn't owe anyone anything. The only thing that's on his mind is finding a cure for his disease, which is mostly for the purpose of saving his life, but you can also argue there's a sort of subconscious desire to meet his father's expectation by taking care of this disease, something that not even his dad could do. The only beacon of light he had was Peter Parker, probably the only person in his life that treated him like an actual human being. For reference, when Spider-Man refused to give away his blood, Harry offered money and expressed how everyone wants his money in a very resentful manner, implying that for years whatever relationship he may have had with anyone was only established because the other side wanted to take advantage of his wealth, and I think this is just how he perceives most people with the exception of Peter Parker. He's likely one of the few people Harry actually respects and would least expect to turn his back on him, which then brings me to another somewhat common criticism I hear. A lot of people like to point out that Harry blaming Peter in the end for turning the way he did was dumb and inconsistent writing, because Peter had warned him twice that injecting the spider DNA could have fucked him up. But here's the thing, what Harry was requesting from Spider-Man was not the same thing he injected into his body later in the movie. Harry wanted Spidey's blood because he was obviously bitten by one of the test spiders, and it turned out to be a very clear successful experiment. That thing that he injected into his arm later in the movie that turned him into a goblin was a spider venom, which already isn't the same thing as someone's mutated blood, though that's not really all that relevant anyway. But what is worth pointing out is that venom was extracted from spiders that had been previously proven to be unsuccessful. Now, we did end up learning that one of the reasons Peter ended up being a successful experiment was because his father literally added his own DNA into the test spiders. But Harry doesn't know that. No one knows that, as a matter of fact. So from his perspective, Spider-Man's DNA is still a clear path into finding a way to cure his disease, and more likely to work than a fucking venom that came from spiders that were repeatedly stated to had not produced good results. So in a way, I understand why he puts the blame on Peter. Not just because he could have helped him by giving his own blood, which had been proven to be successful, but also because he gave him hope that the spider experiments could have been the solution for his problem, but in the end just ended up making things worse once he got too desperate. One of the things Peter attempted to convince Harry was that Spider-Man gives people hope and make them believe that eventually things are gonna be alright. Harry at some point chose to put his trust on that idea by seeing Spidey as the one person who could help him deal with his disease and save his life, or at the very least was an indication that the spider experiments were the solution for his problem. But all it resulted in was A, Spidey refusing to give his blood directly in his face, and B, messing with the spider venom, which ended up deteriorating his body. Which is why he ended up calling Spidey a fraud. He's a fraud when it comes to giving people hope. Now, I'm not saying he's in the right, nor am I saying that his solutions are flawless and carry no risk of fucking with his body. I'm also in no way suggesting that he's carrying fully rational thoughts. But that doesn't mean I can't comprehend his reasoning, especially when 1, he was desperate as hell since his life was on the line, and 2, all of this was revolving around a person he very clearly trusted, and earlier in the movie, this was kind of foreshadowed. When Peter tried to walk away during a conversation with him, Harry brutally responded by saying, "Don't turn your back on me." Now, this is gonna come off as a weird plug, but I want to tackle something else I've seen some people criticize, which is also related to this scene. I think it was Chris Stuckman that brought this up during the fight between Spidey and Electro. When Peter was warning Gwen that she should get the hell out of there, she responded by stating very abrasively that no one makes any decisions for her, and Chris Stuckman's main issue was how that line felt like it came out of nowhere and this hadn't been established or foreshadowed anywhere, but I would like to share my own interpretation of that scene. I think the reason why she said that wasn't so much that she was going through some kind of I'm an independent woman / girl power moment. I think she was just upset because she had a way to help Peter in that situation where there were 2 airplanes that were at risk of clashing and the entire city was out of power. She had a decent understanding of the grid specs and knew how to reset the entire system, so she was in a position where she could clearly offer some kind of help in that situation, but Peter kept refusing because her life was on the line. Which is interesting because this was the exact same situation that led to their breakup. Peter didn't want to break up with her out of his own desire, he just did it because her life was on the line. I think all she's expressing here is that she doesn't want anyone else to make decisions for her, and that it's her own choice to put her life in danger, not anyone else. I'll admit she didn't word herself very clearly, but I'm 99% certain that's what she meant. But getting back to Harry Osborn, him becoming a full-blown villain by the end of the movie was... yeah, it was rushed. That entire Sinister Six scene, it just didn't work. It needed more time for the transition to come off as natural, but I still think that out of all the villains, and honestly characters in general, he was by far the most entertaining to watch. He had all of these people working at Oscorp who were trying to eject him for good reasons, don't get me wrong. He was a young, inexperienced, and emotionally unstable person, but that was still a shitty thing to do. Only for Harry to fight back and taking matters into his own hands. When Harry cornered Donald Mencken after he framed him and got him fired, it was the most gratifying scene in that entire movie. Definitely my favorite character, and probably the only reason why I'm saddened by the fact that this movie didn't get a sequel. I don't think I have anything else to say for this video. There are probably more good things I could share about this movie, but nah, I'm tired and I have to study for exams. The last thing I'll say is leave my boys Harry and Max alone. They did nothing wrong. As for the fucking Rhino, he's garbage. He's a piece of shit. You can hate him all you want. And goodbye.